Gin age and the way that English culture and society was on a nosedive in so many ways, and yet it also had so many parallels with what it happens today. There was extreme abuse of power. There was extreme abuse of people. There was the growing polarity between the very rich and the very poor, and disregard for each other. And the introduction of gin to English society just brainwashed everybody into non-thinking. And we see that today with all kinds of drugs that have been introduced into our society. And that causes a real crisis when people want to consider value and important things, and yet it's sometimes the wicked and the sinful that takes charge. Want to remind you of the background that slavery, the history of slavery has in the history of civilization. Go back to the program I gave you a couple of years ago. You can go on my website and look for William Wilberforce on the bottom, and scroll to the bottom of that page and you'll see this year's selection. And if you click on that review line, it will go through that first hour that we talked about and the whole history of that, which was my effort to completely dismiss, completely eradicate the argument of CRT and its viability. It is an absolute corruption of history. But you need that. You need the background of the slavery of history in man's life in order to really appreciate what we have seen come to in the 19th century and the dramatic change that made. And again, when we move that to modern day, and we know that slavery is now once again even larger than it ever has been, that too can be changed. And that too can be confronted, but it takes more than just man-made effort. You remember that William Wilberforce, at 21 years old, decided he was graduating from college. He decided he was going to be he didn't want to be a businessman. He didn't want to do anything else that might. He didn't want to go into the ministry. Those were the two areas that might bring him income. So he went to the third option, which was to go into politics. And you remember that he was from this little town of Hull, and yet because of his naturally gregarious personality, he was well known. He was well liked in his community, and so it was just a natural thing for him to go after this parliamentary position, to become a member of Parliament, an MP, if you will. And becoming a member of Parliament in those days, Parliament is like our Congress. He was going for the House of Commons, which opposed to the House of Lords. But becoming a member of Parliament in those days was an absolute corruption of character. It was bought, and seats in Parliament were bought, sold, and leased as articles of commerce openly and without any apology whatsoever. Everybody knew of it. Everybody understood that's what you do. And Ben Franklin, who was visiting at one point, said the average price for a seat in Parliament's about £4,000 in his day. And it was a day that bribery and coercion ruled the day. You had extremely wealthy people, and if you wanted to get your way, you just buy the votes you need, and you go on. And that's encouraged by not only the Crown, but the ministry, the Parliament members themselves, the nobility, and the landowners. All the ones with money saw no problem with buying and selling political positions. Wilberforce's own strategy in those days, when he was running for office in this first time, he ran for the small town of Hull that he was from, and he used he counted on his natural popularity. He was a party guy, and his avid practice of social gambling and social gaming and all of the things that everybody was all into, and he used that popularity to his advantage. And in his case, what he did was he threw an ox roast for his 21st birthday. Come to my 21st birthday and then elect me. And this ox roast cost him 9,000 pounds, which is somebody translated, not me, but somebody translated that to saying he shelled out $2.4 million on that ox roast. Everybody knew what it was all about. And guess what? He was elected. It's great. He defeated two other opponents. He took off the oath of office in 1780, and he was on his way. No looking back. This young man had potential and promise. Now, a little aside here. This was during the war with the colonies. And so when I was reading this background material, I found it very interesting to hear the British side of things. So let me just take a minute or two to give you the British side of things. Britain was heavily invested in the colonies, and all they wanted was the tax money that came from that, and they didn't want any reprisals. They didn't want any grief. And Lord North, that's his wonderful picture up there, his wonderful painting. Lord North was prime minister during the day, and he got very irked at the protests that were going on in the colonies. He had heard about the Tea Party in Boston, and he decided, well, we can't have this. And so he decided the thing to do was to punish these lousy colonists. And so in doing that, in punishing them, in being hard on them, he invited himself into a war with the colonies. And you remember that the colonies, when they were wrestling with this, the big decision was, can we compromise or do we call it in everything? Do we go to war or do we try to just compromise our way out of this? And eventually the colonies decided, no, we are all in for war. We want independence. That was something Lord North did not count on. And so that when he went to war, he just assumed that this was going to conclude with compromise in some way. And so he launched a humongous first attack, shipping over thousands of his military over into the New England area. And he just imagined that they would walk all over them, stifle them, and it would all be over and done with. Now, part of the problem about waging war in those days with the colonies, who were all the way across the Atlantic, is that communication is not immediate. We pick up the phone, we watch news on television, we know exactly what's going on somewhere else in the world without any problem. In those days, you were probably 2 months delay. And so that was part of the problem. It was 2 months later that Lord North would hear of the Boston Tea Party. He sent his armies over there. It'd be 4 months before he'd get any news back. This was something that everything was happening in a place and in a situation where he was not in direct control. But once he engaged them, and once he realized we have a war here, again, he just assumed that things would take care of themselves, and so he left it to his subordinates. He had a country to run himself. So he left it to his subordinates, and things just went from bad to worse. By 1778, you remember the war goes from 1775 to 1783. By 1778, the colonies had allies in France and Spain. Now, we often think, because we're self-centered, we often think that meant that the France and the Spanish came over and here to fight. No, that wasn't the case. They fought the English over there. And so all of a sudden, the British Parliament found themselves fighting this war for American independence on 4 continents. They had their hands full. We always think that, the war just happened here and it was just in our situation. That's all we were concerned with. And that's all you hear about in the history books. But all of a sudden they were fighting a war on 4 different continents. And by 1778, Lord North said, okay, this is not going well. I'm going to have to find somebody to blame. I'm going to shove off the attention of the colonies, and I'm going to invest more in the West Indies. You remember what's growing in the West Indies? Sugar cane, very good. Sugar cane and tobacco are growing. The cash cow is more in the West Indies and in Brazil than in North America. And so he is actually already giving up on the war, and he's protecting their investment in the West Indies. In October of 1781, Cornwallis surrenders after the siege of Yorktown. 2 months later, he gets the word, and he realizes it's all over. It was so unpopular, a war in England, that immediately upon getting the word that they had surrendered to the colonists, Lord North received a no-confidence vote, and he was kicked out of office right away. That's their side. That's their side of things. Just thought you might like to know about that. When Wilberforce entered Parliament in 1780, it was smack dab in the middle of that war. And so one of the things he made his first name in was being absolutely livid about the war going on and about Lord North's policies. He railed against Lord North, mostly in a way to just get people to attention for himself. But he said, while the present ministry existed, there are no prospects of either peace or happiness for Britain. He's getting us into a war, and of course you always have the doves and the hawks, and if you're not in support of those that are running the war, you're against the war. That's the way it always is. Remember that when we see wars going on, there's always those who see an investment in a purpose and an accomplishment, and then others say, we shouldn't be there. What are we doing here? And it's just the same way all the time. The economic and the collateral difficulties tied to the war had become a great sense of discontent for Britain. They were not getting all of the products that they wanted. The investors weren't getting wealthy. Things were not happening as nicely. This war is dragging us down. We're very disappointed, and it was a bad time in there. Now they were stuck in a war that was widening out, and I didn't want a war. They just wanted a compromise, and they were just hoping that everything would settle down. But by war's end, 1783, Wilberforce was only 24, and you remember I said he was born rather sickly to begin with. He physically was not a specimen of manhood. And even by 24, he was already starting to have physical situational issues. His eyesight was starting to fail him. Now, for a member of Parliament, that's catastrophe, because you spend a lot of your time reading and researching and writing. And for him to start having trouble with his eyes meant that he might be threatened on that front, and he wouldn't know how long he would be able to serve. He was starting to really get an idea of his weaknesses. But that didn't stop him from having fun. And maybe it even stirred him on. I don't have much time, let's do this. And he entered the social scene in London. He moved to London, he entered the social scene. Now Wilberforce's wealth was never as much as many of the other members of Parliament. Remember, he inherited his wealth from his grandfather, who had the shipping business, and then his father, who was a merchant. But those are only, that's below the top of that pyramid, the pyramid where the really rich are. And those are the ones he's rubbing shoulders with, the really rich. But he's got enough money to satisfy himself and to fuel his interests and his pursuits. And so he joins in the gentlemen's clubs that were there, which means he spent a lot of time card playing and gambling and drinking and doing all of the important things that Parliament members do, and establishing political friendships He took pride in the fact that he was very independent in those days, and he couldn't be labeled with a brand, and that meant that everybody was pursuing him. Would you, consider this? We vote for this. He didn't have the label on his side that usually people did. And of course, he purchased a very expensive residence and a very lovely area, and he traveled very liberally. In the process, he grew politically ambitious. He realized this is just the beginning, and he could have a great life here if all he did was enjoy himself. In 1783, Wilberforce decided to go to France. This wasn't the trip I was talking about last time, an earlier one. He goes to France to visit King Louis XVI at a time when Ben Franklin is in town visiting with France, with King Louis, obviously plying for that wants France in the war on their side. He knows Wilberforce is against the war, and so he kind of feels him out a little bit. And interestingly enough, the history books say that Franklin was beginning at this time his own change of heart regarding abolition, and that he might have put a seed into Wilberforce's mind, but it's way too early for any real thought to develop. One historian says this. He says, Franklin was virtually alone among America's foremost founding fathers in daring to break with what has well been described as the silence of the founders on the subject of slavery. You understand why that's the case, don't you? Most of them were from the South. His moral courage was demonstrated at the end of his life. Wilberforce's moral courage as an abolitionist would be demonstrated for the rest of his. A very prophetic statement to make. Wilberforce, in the very next year, Wilberforce adds that seat at Yorkshire to his seat at Hull, so now he has even more influence and he's more attractive to others for his vote. At one of the most sought-after positions in the House of Commons, he's at the height of his political success. If all he does is coast, he is in Fat City for the rest of his life. And I paint this picture deliberately because I want you to understand, he has no regrets. He has nothing in the back pocket that he thinks he ought to do. There's nobody whispering in his ear. There's nothing happening that's making him going to change his mind. He is doing exactly what he wanted to do, which was enjoy himself and be a hedonist to the nth degree. That was all he ever cared to do. He was, like I say, he joined 5 gentlemen's clubs. One's not enough. You got to have the more popular places to be. He was popular at all the parties and social events. And this is what he said much later in his life, reflecting on this time. He said, I was altogether in a profligate place. Profligate's not a word we use very much, so I thought I would define it for you. First, it means given to or characterized by licentiousness and dissipation. Given to or characterized by reckless waste, wildly extravagant. And third definition is overthrown, beaten, and conquered. And he was indeed all three. Sold out to hedonism and to self-protection and to enjoying his life as best he could. There was no reason for this man to look back. No tragedy is going to hit his trail. No flat tires, no confrontations, no deaths that are going to make him wake up. He was sold out completely. That was when he decided to go on this continental tour that I talked to you about last time. He decided to take a trip to the French Riviera. I tried to get a picture of it back in the 1800s, but I couldn't. That's the French Riviera now, and it's very lovely, and of course it's very hoity-toity. And he would take a stagecoach ride and travel, which meant he was spending the party was spending most of their time traveling. He went with his mother and his sister and 2 female cousins for restorative airs. Most of the ways that you would deal with sickness or disease was to simply take some time off and go to the country and rest and reflect and get stronger and get away from the city, the smog, for instance, one thing. And that was one of the best ways that people knew how to get better after being ill. And so he takes he takes this trip, and as I said last time, he looks around and he says, I'm traveling with all women. No offense, women. I said, I need a man to talk to. He invited one close friend, and he couldn't do it. And then he thought, for some reason, providentially, of an old tutor he had many years ago for a little while in college. And his name was Isaac Milner. Milner had to request leave of absence from his teaching job. He wasn't wealthy. He wasn't upper crust at all. But he was a teacher, he was a tutor. And not being wealthy himself, he jumped at the chance that a member of Parliament would take him along and pay for the whole thing himself and enjoy himself on the French Riviera. I'm not going to turn that down, right? Let's get a load of this guy Milner. There's a portrait of him in his glory days. Isaac Milner, I'll just describe him with a few quotations. First of all, William Wilberforce's quotation later describing Milner. He said, he was a most intelligent and excellent friend of mine. That's how he remembered him. Marianne Thornton said, a rough, loud, and rather coarse man, the most enormous man it was ever my fate to see in a drawing room. But he was, without a doubt, and with no argument, intellectually brilliant. And he possessed a gentle nature and a ready wit. Here was a scholar. Here was a man who loved and enjoyed life too. And that made him a wonderful companion for Wilberforce. His hideout was Queen's College in Cambridge, and in 1774 his academic performance was considered, that's Latin, what does it stand for? Incomparable. The man was superior in his excellence by college tutors. In 1776 he had the position of a fellow, the Jacksonian Professor of Natural Philosophy. Don't ask me who Jackson is there. I don't know. This is England. Doesn't matter, right?
Lots of Jacksons.
Yes, lots of Jacksons. His company. Wilberforce found his company very much to his taste. I found him highly congenial. Milner joined Wilberforce at all the dinners that he wanted to go to, all the parties that he wanted to go to, played cards, he gambled like everyone else, was involved in all of the high social mixers. One quotation says, while Mrs. Wilberforce refused Sunday invitations, Milner had no such scruples. He appeared in all respects like an ordinary man of the world, mixing like myself, this is Wilberforce talking, in all companies and joining as readily as others in the prevalent Sunday parties. Indeed, when I engaged him as a companion in my tour, I knew not that he had any deeper principles. He obviously had no regard for the Lord's Day as a Christian, which is what he turns out to be. Conversation in the carriage and in the French Riviera would be the entertainment of the day. You would talk about anything and everything that came up, and that meant just any and every topic. And you would chit-chat back and forth, and you would talk and you would laugh. And one of course, those subjects that would come up from time to time was religion, Christianity, Anglicanism, Methodism, evangelicalism, rather. And Wilberforce would always express no patience whatsoever with evangelicals. He would mock the Christians. He would dismiss them. He had no use for them whatsoever. And surprisingly, that was the only time that Milner stood up to him, the whole trip. And he said, you really need to examine these things a little more honestly. Which took Wilberforce by absolute surprise. He was not obnoxious about it. He was not overboard about it. He wasn't beating Wilberforce over the head. This was his host. He paid for it all. He was enjoying the French Riviera. He's not going to step on Wilberforce's toes. But when the time came, he took advantage of it in a very nice, gentle way. All he said was, you should just be a little more, you should approach these things with a little more honesty and not let your prejudice get carried away. Now, later on in the trip, Wilberforce just happened to be thumbing through some of the books that his sister had brought with her to read. And one of the books he found, he knew was being circulated around London at the time. It was a book called The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul. And it was by a pastor named Philip Doddridge. And he asked Milner about it. He said, what do you think of this book? And Milner said very quickly, it is one of the best books ever written. Let us take it with us and read it on our journey. An invitation. Give you a word about Philip Doddridge. Philip Doddridge lived from 1702 to 1751, which means that he had just died 30 years ago when this book was being circulated. He was an English nonconformist, that meant a Congregationalist minister. He was raised by a Presbyterian, that's his big claim to fame. Samuel Clark. He sought independency, became a pastor of Northampton. He was a friend of Isaac Watts, and he was a prolific hymn writer in his own right. We have one of his hymns in the Trinity, number 681. I don't think we're familiar with it, but you can look at it. The book he wrote, The Rise and Progress of Religion in the Soul, was built on a theme that Richard Baxter had set into place. And what he means by that is it was evangelistic in nature, not in saying, consider salvation, I invite Christ into your heart. It started as the gospel always must start, and that's with the bad news. And it probes the heart. Some of you guys are in my Bible study on Wednesday nights, and we're reading a book that Wilberforce himself wrote later, and we have found that it's difficult reading in some portions. Doddridge's book is not difficult reading. It's difficult to read, especially for someone like Wilberforce in his present condition, because it is so clear, it is so step by step, and it is so convicting. And it goes on and walks you through the entire deliverance of the gospel in a very masterful way. It was translated into 7 languages, so it's getting around, and the evangelicals are reading it, and it's really lighting them on fire. There is the landscape of England beginning to show some change. It was referred to later by C.H. Spurgeon simply as that holy book. I have printouts of the table of contents, and I put it on late so you didn't see it. Maybe on your way back, if you're interested, get a copy of it. And look at the chapter headings, and you'll see how the book is written. It really is quite amazing. Let me read to you a couple of things here. The book emphasized the importance of daily self-examination, prayer, early morning devotions, diligence in business, prudence in recreation, the careful observation of providence, the importance of solitude, the value of time. It stressed the certainty of death and judgment, and the need for humankind to show its usefulness throughout a lifetime. The message of the book was designed first to be worrying. That's how it's put. And this is a quote from it. "Thousands are, no doubt, already in hell, whose guilt never equaled thine. And it is astonishing that God hath spared thee to read this representation of thy case." And then to be uplifting, he writes, "You will wish to commence a hero in the cause of Christ, opposing with a rigorous resolution the strongest efforts of the powers of darkness, the inward corruption of your own heart, and all the outward difficulties you may meet with in the way of your duty, while in the cause and in the strength of Christ you go on conquering and to conquer." The book is still available. You can get it online. You can download it free. And it's worth a look. I'll just put it that way. It's worth a look. One historian writes this about Wilberforce reading the book and talking to Milner about it day after day after day after day. "Closeted in his carriage with Milner and the Greek version of the New Testament, to the point that the ladies complained of him paying them insufficient attention, Wilberforce was becoming gradually convinced of the evangelical Christian case. Very soon he was overwhelmed by the force of what he now believed to be true. By the time he was preparing to return to England in late October of 1785, the deep guilt, the bad news of the gospel, friends, cannot be overlooked. You cannot give the gospel until you paint the person's need for it. The deep guilt, the black ingratitude of my past life forced itself upon me in the strongest colors, and I condemn myself for having wasted my precious time and opportunities and talents. It had been a mental and spiritual experience of enormous power. When it came, the climax of his conversion was neither as dramatic nor seemingly as supernatural as in many other documented cases of the 18th century, but that's precisely what it was, supernatural. Anybody else would pick up that book and go, put it down. Not even pay attention to it. You might read it. It might not have the same effect on you. This is the work of God. This is the work of the supernatural God changing a heart of stone to a heart of flesh. Wilberforce didn't have to read that book. He didn't have to finish reading that book. He didn't have to put up with all of the things Milner told him to do about it, talking about it. He didn't have to do any of that. He could have gone right back to his own pleasure and his own hedonism, but something drew him in that would not let him go. And it upset his entire life. It upset his entire life. Now, before I go on, I want to remind you, we've already covered some of these. I want to remind you of the recorded effectiveness of reading a particular book that has been used by the Holy Spirit to change a man's heart and life. We start with Martin Luther. You remember the classic illustration of that? You know, he was a monk always looking for ways to pay his debts. He read the book of Romans and he said it was like the gates of heaven opened up before him. It changed his life. It was so dangerous that King James, who named a Bible after himself, was famous for saying, well, we can't have people reading, thinking men will not be slaves. And so King James' famous book was the King's Book of Sports, and I've told you about that. King's Book of Sports said, these are the sports you can play on the Lord's Day. This is how they're played. Go to it, man. He was encouraging people not to observe the Lord's Day, not to worship God, to get all wrapped up in sports on the Lord's Day. It's like everybody in our society has read that book. John Bunyan would not have written Pilgrim's Progress if he had not been arrested and thrown into jail in his day for his nonconformity. His conversion was after he had married his blind wife. Her dowry, what she brought to the marriage, were 2 books. One of them was The Plain Man's Pathway to Heaven. John Bunyan read that book, changed his heart, changed his life. William Wilberforce, with The Rise and Progress of Religion of the Soul. If we get to Abraham Kuyper soon, we're going to find that his book was called The Heir of Redcliffe. It's a good thing to go back and read these books that these men had come across and had changed their hearts and lives. You would get a real taste for and a flavor for what it was that resonated in their souls and how the Lord used that. Many of them are available. You can pull them down free of charge from the internet. And what it tells me is, I encourage the young people, don't waste your lives playing video games. Don't be like Wilberforce for the first 24 years and think you've got it all made. Read something. Read something quality. Read something that will draw you close to Christ. Who knows what the Lord would do in your life? Conviction was not an easy thing. He couldn't just pray the sinner's prayer and everything else would be rosy. He couldn't just march in and say, well, I'm a Christian MP now. In those days, that was still a hard and fast line politically. You were either normal, like the rest of us, or you were one of them. And if you were one of them, you belong in the church. We still have that kind of division today. Even though the Constitution says very clearly that God created us with certain inalienable rights. I guess, is that the Declaration of Independence? Anyway, what we have seen ever since is that politicians want us to believe that your Christian faith has no place in politics. We have the same thing. We have the same abuse of Christians today. We see the same regard, the same despising, the same dismissal. Wilberforce knew, becoming a Christian in the real sense of the term was not just something that I add to my resume. It changes everything. It reverses my entire set of priorities. It changes my habits, my behaviors, my friends. Everything comes to a crashing end here, as well as to a promising new beginning. He sensed the call would be completely to reverse all of his priorities. And what about his occupation? What am I going to do? Maybe anybody in this position should go into the church, should be a minister. That's what you do when you get converted like this. You become a minister. So many others did. Being an evangelist reminds you, this is his reflection on those days in his life. The first years I was in Parliament, I did nothing. Nothing that is of any purpose. My own distinction was my darling object. My own distinction. My own prestige. My own popularity was my darling object. He would protect that at all costs. And now that's got to go too. Being an evangelical in those days means very similar things that it does today, but I thought I would point out the distinctions. Being an evangelical meant a belief in the providential will of God. God works through second causes, and directs and applies. But being an evangelical was very much an individualistic kind of thing. You were not associated with a church. You didn't go find an evangelical church. There were evangelicals in this place and in that place and the other place, but there was no such thing as an organized church or denomination. Evangelicalism in and of itself was much more individual. It was you and God, and that was your association with other people was not critical. That will actually play a big part in going forward in what Wilberforce did and how he was able to do it. An evangelical believes the Christian principles are applied to all areas of life, that this kind of makes Milner, this casts Milner in a kind of a bad light. Milner apparently was an evangelical, but he enjoyed himself. We heard about that. And it didn't, he had no scruples about doing so. But an evangelical in those days realized that it had to be a hard and fast cut with the world, hard and fast division. And so, as ambassadors for Christ on earth, any hint of drunkenness, which meant drinking, period, any gambling, dueling, unfairness in the penal system, even every form of immorality, lack of observance of the Sabbath, they're all condemned. Wilberforce understands this now. This is part of his crisis. How can I be a member of Parliament, that corrupt institution, and be an evangelical? And he really has no answer for it. And he is wrestling with this for a couple of years. Finally, he decides he will seek out his former friend, John Newton. John Newton, to remind you, was that slave trader himself who came to see his life pass before him on a ship. Several years later, he finally is persuaded and his heart changed to believe. He quits the slave trade after having a stroke. He goes into the ministry. What else do you do? I'm an evangelical. What else do I do? He goes into the ministry. He preaches at one church, and while he's preaching at that one church, that is when he meets 9-year-old William Wilberforce, and the two of them enjoy a friendship with one another. He disciples and he mentors Wilberforce for the period of time, you remember, until his mother got real scared of the religious influence that he was getting and pulled him back home. Newton now has changed to a second pastorate, and he has written Amazing Grace. And now Wilberforce decides to seek Newton out. He goes to his church, which is no small church, and he stands outside because he is really afraid to talk to this man. He has made such a name for himself, and he's really afraid that Newton is going to condemn him and rebuke him and bring him down to his knees and tell him his entire life has to change. That's the only thing he thinks. That's the only choice he thinks he has. But he finally gets the courage to go talk to John Newton. If you guys have seen Amazing Grace, the video, it's a nice summary of the story of Wilberforce. Leaves a whole lot out, as every movie does. Rather than show it to you officially, one reason I decided not to was because of the scene here between Wilberforce and Newton. Sympathetically, I understand what the producers are trying to do. They're trying to display Newton's repentance for being in a slave trade and for the change of heart that he has and for how he is content to be a servant for Christ. That's displayed in the fact that he wears rags and that Wilberforce finds him mopping the floor like just an ordinary custodian. He has a conversation with him in the movie as if there really isn't a relationship here. And as a result of that, Newton comes across angry and pokes his finger in Wilberforce's chest and says, "Man up." That's basically what he says. That's not anywhere near the truth. None of that is true. And that's one of the reasons I didn't want to show it to you. Newton welcomed Wilberforce in, recalled the days when they were friends when Wilberforce was a young boy, talked with him about the gospel, heard Wilberforce's heart, talked about what needed to be and continued to disciple and mentor Wilberforce for 10 more years. This was the renewal of that father-son relationship that these two really had. My favorite quote from Newton is this one. He says, "I am not the man I ought to be. I am not the man I wish to be, and I am not the man I hope to be, but by the grace of God, I am not the man I used to be." And but forgive me for this, I see no grace in Newton here. I see a man who is still burdened with guilt, and nothing allows him to get away from it. But he's going to get Wilberforce out of it. But the John Newton that mentored Wilberforce was a man of God's grace and love and wisdom. Big difference, big difference. 1785, Newton greeted him, admitting that he had always had hopes and confidence for Wilberforce's conversion. Newton claimed his anxieties, and for 10 years he fortified Wilberforce in combining his religious beliefs with a continued political career. This was before Wilberforce had any thought of abolition. And so Newton wasn't after him saying, "You need to free the slaves." He didn't do that. He was just drawing Wilberforce into the fold, making a Christian man out of him. And he calmed his anxieties and mentored him. And he wrote later, "I believe you are the Lord's servant, and you are in the post which he has assigned you. And though it appears to be more arduous and requiring more self-denial than my own, I know that he who has called you to it can afford you strength according to your day." So together, they wrestled with this for several years until they finally came to the conclusion, "Wilberforce, you can do more good staying in the Parliament than you can doing anything else." And Wilberforce finally came to that conclusion himself. That was a very difficult thing for him to do. After struggling for over a year, he was finally resolved, sat down in 1786, and wrote in his diary a very interesting cryptic note to himself. He said, "My walk is a public one, my business is in the world, and I must mix in the assemblies of men or quit the post which Providence seemed to have assigned to me." So that he's in that turmoil. He's in that wrestling. 1787, this is the next year after that decision. He starts to be facing the challenge of a lifetime. We often think that maybe Wilberforce took this on all by himself. Even if you watch the video, you're very familiar with the fact that there wasn't anybody else in the Parliament that was on his side, and the world was against him. In fact, that was his moniker for a while. It was like Athanasius against the world. It was Wilberforce against the world. Not true. It wasn't true. It wasn't even true from the beginning. The seeds of his passion for abolition began in 1787 with three particular men that had significant influence on him, if only minor at the time. The first was James Ramsay. I'll talk about him a little bit next time. He was a pastor when Wilberforce knew him. The other one was Captain Sir Charles Middleton, a member of Parliament himself. He would become Admiral Middleton after the war. And the third was a very good friend of his, even from before his Christian days, by the name of William Pitt, who became the Prime Minister. William Pitt was not a Christian as far as I can tell, but he was very sensitive and appreciative to the integrity that the Christian faith gave to Wilberforce. Interesting, isn't it? He admired Wilberforce for something he himself refused to have or refused to look into. So enormous, so dreadful, so irremediable did the trade's wickedness appear that my own mind was completely made up for abolition. Let the consequences be what they would, I from this time determined that I would never rest until I had effected its abolition. God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. Right? Nobody, you're snickering, aren't you? I did too, first time I read it. Suppression of the slave trade, we can see that. We can appreciate that. That's got to go. That's evil. That's wicked. But somehow the reformation of manners is like, which side do I put my napkin on? My friends, the first one would never have happened had it not been for the second. You have to change society from bumper to bumper if you want to see change. That's the lesson that Wilberforce has for us. Okay, any questions? Yes?
So when you talked about evangelicalism, so when did the Presbyterian Church, maybe even the Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, all get labeled under evangelical when they weren't originally?
Okay, I'm grasping at straws here because I wasn't prepared for that. Philip's ready to answer. I'm ignoring Philip. This is my show, Philip. Primarily in the United States, I would say that when we experience things like the Second Great Awakening and the preaching of more and more men who would not draw people's attention to the church, seeded an evangelicalism that slowly grew in the United States and permeated the various denominations, and changed them from within.
Because I always thought evangelicalism was that's happened at the Reformation. It's kind of just a newer name.
Evangelicalism sounds like something generic, but it always has had its own distinction, its own character. Okay, Philip, stand up and tell us.
Well, no, I mean that's a good summary. It's a movement that in the 18th century sort of was within denominations and across denominations that purposely sought. I think the way that you put it was didn't have its own ecclesiology, but it was an attempt to renew the ecclesiologies that were already.
It was a revitalization kind of thing.
So it was an attempt to revive within denominations,
Right.
within those movements.
Right. He's just saying I'm right. Anything else?